We are indeed honored to have with us one of the brave young voices of New Indian writing, Anjum Hasan, as has already been introduced by the organizer. And we'll be taking up for discussion Anjum Hasan's latest novel, History's Angel. Now I'd like to take off from where the previous session ended, which was about sports and the classroom. Well, let me take the audience here back to history and your classrooms. How was history taught to us? I recall history as just another subject. We had a textbook over which there was hardly any debate. And history, along with a few other subjects, always took a backseat in a system that prioritized the studying of science and maths. Well, the situation has changed a great deal now. The study of history, or rather, the teaching of history, is a different ball game altogether. One that has seen a lot of polarized debates, and one which is strewn and riddled with problems galore. And that is at the backbone of history's angel. Because we have as a protagonist here, Alif, a young, moving towards middle age gentleman who teaches history in a school. And there begins the problems that this novel takes us along. I would like to invite Anjum, first of all, to tell us about the choice of her title, History's Angel, in a book about history. It is, of course, known to most of us that it's a phrase that she's borrowed from Walter Benjamin, who speaks about a painting by Klee in which you have a figure who depicts history, pulled between the past, the present, and the future. And it is in that in-between space that this novel is set. So over to Anjum now, and about the title, History's Angel.
Thank you so much, Bindu. Yes, it definitely has a reference to the Walter Benjamin essay that is fairly well known, but I also hoped that even if the reader didn't know about the Benjamin essay, it would be evocative on its own. The idea of somebody who is a sort of a emissary or a spokesperson or a champion of the historical view, I guess one could say, right? Because Alif, my character, is not in any sense heroic. He's a very unassuming, low-key lover, I think, of everyday life more than anything else. And in his case, everyday life consists of going to this fairly mid-level school, which is in Daryaganj, where he lives in Delhi, and trying to interest his students in really what's in the textbook, because at this point in the novel, things have not deteriorated to such a degree that you have to supplement the textbook on your own if you're going to teach children. Even the basically sort of factual context of recent and sort of from the late modern period onwards Indian history. And I was doing an event on the book in Kasauli, which is a small town in Himachal. They have a literary festival. Every town in India has a literary festival now. So Kasauli has a lot of people coming in from Chandigarh, which is the nearest big city. And it was like this, an open air venue, large lawn, lots of people listening. And this young woman comes up to me after the session when I'm signing books, and she says, I am the character in your novel because I teach history to 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds. And what Alif does in the book is, like I said, he's not particularly radical. He just tries to animate textbook history by maybe bringing in a little more first-hand experience, and he does it by taking his children out. So very early in the novel, he's on they're on a school trip, expedition to Humayun's tomb. He has been doing that regularly since he started teaching. And what this lady tells me is that even though I'm saying I'm Alif, things are worse because at the moment there's nothing left in the textbook that can make a child secular. So, and then I was at Jaipur a few days ago and I met another teacher of history who came up and said, I'm the character in your book. So now I don't know what's gonna happen next, but it's always lovely when people identify, I think. That's what fiction always tries to do. And this gentleman was from Britain, and he said, I am the dreamy, ineffective lover of history who has only taught young people the subject all over the world. But he said something very interesting. So the lady said something very interesting to me, is that she feels she's Alif, but even the degree of freedom Alif has may not be possible. If I were to write this novel this year, it may have been a different novel, and I only wrote it like 5 years ago. And that gives me pause. This gentleman, on the other hand, of course, had taught in Britain, so there wasn't a problem there about what can be in the textbook and what can't. But what he said made me think. He said, it's fine that you have purveyors of history, you have people like Alif who just wants to make it come alive. But he also said which history, because for instance, Second World War, which is taught in Britain as a war between largely Western powers with Japan thrown in, also had, as we know, huge numbers of people from this subcontinent fighting, and that's not been part of mainstream history teaching in the West. So again, I think Alif is somebody who, for me, would fulfill that role, because, for instance, in the Humayun's tomb scene, of course, it's very textbook history. It's the Mughals. We all know what it's about. But he wants them to see this beautiful thing that, is right there next door to Daryaganj. But at the same time, when they're finished, he reads them a poem by Safdar Hashmi. Now, this is an actual poem. Of course, we know who Safdar Hashmi is, the very well-known theatre personality who was also a writer of poems for children. And that I discovered only recently. I, of course, knew his history as a theatre person, as an activist, as a writer. And he has a beautiful poem about the vanity of kings, And so I put that little poem in the book because as a history teacher, Alif is also, of course, he also has that human bent, right? He's also aware that the children have to know that this monument, even though it's so grand and says so much about the glory of the Mughals, is also ultimately a time-bound thing that's going to vanish into the mists of time. So yeah, all of those things are what I'm thinking of, and I think with fiction you are always trying to bring in that human element as often as possible. So in this case, when you're talking about history, you're also talking about eternity. So it's history and eternity. With that I'm still thinking about that history teacher from Chandigarh. I think what it made me realize, because she was so animated, is that, like you said, history in school it was no great shakes. We're not taught history in a particularly exciting way. But I think, at least up to my generation, what mattered more was the teacher, not the textbook. There was nothing to be discussed with regard to the textbook. It was the same history that more or less everyone was reading. And we were just talking earlier, Bindu, and I asked if your students or your children know about the history of Kerala, and you said very little because we read the same history. And it was the same where I grew up in Shillong. You're reading the same history in the same order. But I remember my teacher because she was a great storyteller, and she, in Shillong where I went to school, it was cold half the year, and she would be wearing the shawl, and I think she would feel too cold to take her hands outside the shawl, so she never opened the book. She knew it backwards, and she never cared to open that book, but she would just tell it as a story. And I think it's because of her that I got fascinated by history as narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back to the history as narrative part of it, but I would like to begin our discussion on this book by going to the very back of the back side, the blurb, in fact, which has contributions both by William Dalrymple, Amit Chaudhary, and of course a few others as well. But what Dalrymple tells us about the book really catches our attention. It's a wonderful Delhi novel for our times. He calls it a Shahr-e-Ashab of New India, which is Shahr-e-Ashab is a kind of, it's a genre, isn't it? It's a lament, and that is in fact what the novel ends with. Delhi, you end with a quotation from the poet Taqi Mir Taqi Mir, who says, Delhi jo ek sheher tha, alam mein intiqab, but it's no longer that, isn't it? So what was this, what was it that impelled you to place this novel in Delhi and write it as a lament for something that was no longer present? Delhi becomes a symbol for something that's gone, something that's disappeared or been made to disappear.
Yeah, I think Sheher-e-Ashab was a genre of Urdu poetry that appeared sort of after the 1857 revolt, when Delhi was destroyed. Of course, it had been destroyed many times before that and come back to life. And so Delhiwalas were used to calamity. But this seemed an especially calamitous turning point, and there were poets who had to leave Delhi. Ghalib remained. He still had some patronage from the Mughals, and then after that from the British. But for others, there was no one to sustain them. So that was to me, that's a very categorical sort of writing, which is saying, this is not the place that nurtured me. This is not the Delhi that I knew. I think Alif is and is not in that tradition, because of course he laments that there was a certain cosmopolitan culture in Delhi of a sort that has been replaced by a much more money-driven society. And that cosmopolitan culture actually is a modern culture. He's thinking of an era which was called the English Peace, and this was just before the 1857 revolt. Things changed after that. The institutions that were created in that period, of course, remain, and the most prominent was Delhi College. And Alif is fascinated by this period because there are very, very God-fearing, religious, in a broad sense, Muslims who are at the same time very modern, and they're well-known figures from that era, like Munshi Zakaullah, who was a mathematician and a historian, and so on. So the idea of a Muslim progressiveness, I think that's what he's nostalgic about. So the Mughals, for him, are wonderful in many respects, but he's also often cautioning himself to not get sentimental about them. And I think that's a real danger today. We are often romanticizing the Mughals. There's a whole genre, I think, of romantic writing drawing on Mughal culture. And Alif is aware of the limitations of that while wanting his students to appreciate what the Mughals did. He is definitely regretful that Muslim progressivism of a certain kind did not take off. That for sure. But he's also, he lives in Old Delhi. He sits on the steps of Jama Masjid almost every evening. He's very much part of that which he mourns. And he sees these busloads of tourists coming to look at the ruins of Old Delhi, and he never feels himself one of them. So I wouldn't call the book a lament only. I don't think it's a lament exclusively. There are elements of grief, elements of tragedy and regret, but it's not about a character who's saying everything was so much better when the Muslims ruled this city or the Muslims ruled this land. He also is not a fan of the idea of history as heritage only. he feels then he himself becomes heritage in that view, because he's the figure in the scene when people are going past in a tourist coach, and he doesn't feel himself to be that much of an anachronism. He is somewhat of an anachronism, but he hopes that he can still like sort of think for himself and speak for himself.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought in the word anachronism, because it's along those lines that I would like to draw your attention now by inviting again the audience's attention to the cover, which I learn Anjum herself chose, which has on its cover an image from Imran Qureshi's series, Moderate Enlightenment. It's a series that in many ways challenges many of the conventional notions, and you have images in the series which place people of a certain denomination in very unconventional positions, carrying things that you do not normally associate with, for example, in a miniature painting, in a Mughal miniature painting. And we have one such painting here of a figure who's clad in, conventional clothes that you associate with a certain community, but wearing camouflage socks. So something very interesting in this image. And the whole series, Moderate Enlightenment by Imran Qureshi. Could you shed more light on that?
Well, I just chanced upon Imran Qureshi's work at some point before there was talk of the cover, and then when we did start discussing it, the designers from the publishing house was sending fairly conventional images of Muslim life, including there was one option I remember, which was of a ring of burqa-clad women, and I just was gobsmacked because I said, how does this represent the book at all? It's misleading, I think. So there's still this, it's a very tricky thing, I think, to be writing about Muslims in India today, because you're almost inevitably going to be pigeonholed. And I'm taking that risk because I am writing about believers, I'm writing about non-believers, I'm writing about orthodox people, I'm writing about fanatics. It's the whole spectrum. But the most important thing is that there is the spectrum, and Alif is very much at the reasonable end of it. And I think a cover that had a ring of burqa-clad women would just totally give the wrong message. So then I remembered Imran's work. He's an artist who takes the Mughal miniature, like you said, but does, to me, very funny, ironic things with it. And this image, yeah, like you said, it's a man who looks like he's in a Mughal garden. It has all the elements of a Mughal garden, but he's wearing these socks that are very out of place, and he's writing with a ballpoint pen. And to me, that just summed up Alif for me, in a way. The figure who's contemplating is at home in the tradition, but is also not completely beholden to it, is able to speak for himself and think for himself still. That's what I was trying to do. I mean, he is a particular kind of Indian liberal, more than being a Muslim. He's an Indian liberal. And I think the book is really a conversation about that. How do you maintain your fidelity to a certain Indian liberal tradition when people are constantly telling you you're a Muslim?
And getting you into a very polarized position, right? Yeah. Yeah, and talking about paintings, I'm again very curious to know more about another painting that the novel refers to, and which in many ways again tells me a lot about Alif. There's a particular painting that has more or less remained in his memory. This is one of Emperor Akbar, and it's not Akbar in his normal grandeur, but an Akbar where you find him in his old age, looking lovingly at a falcon, and then a little toenail peeping out. And that is something that Alif remembers, and it's at a very crucial point in the novel that there is a reference to it. Yeah, it's based on a real painting, or a sketch, I would say.
Yeah, there's a museum of Islamic art in Denmark, in Copenhagen. And I remember going there a few years ago. I had just started writing the novel then, I think, and it's beautifully curated, and series of rooms, one after the other. And I remember I was the only person, and I went deeper and deeper, and I started feeling I'm going into this crypt. But they have wonderful art from all over the Muslim world historically. And there was a book there lying on one of the tables in that crypt-like museum, which was addressing the question of the conventional view that Muslims are against the representative, the figurative image, I mean, not the the human figure is not meant to be drawn or in any way reproduced. Right, but then how do you put that alongside all the art that the Muslim empires, whether it's the Ottomans or whether it's the Mughals, have patronized? And so the writers of this book go into how, in fact, in eras when Muslims were confident, there has been so much figurative art. And there was a sketch, which is, I think it was a pencil sketch of Akbar in that book, where it's not worked into a larger frame or anything. It's just a very rough sketch. I don't know who the artist was, but I was so struck with it because it was so modern. And he's just sitting there with a falcon on his arm and bare feet, which is almost sacrilegious. You're seeing a Mughal in bare feet, maybe, at his leisure. And that's what Alif remembers when he's thinking about someone in his own family who is saying, why are these children painting, drawing people? It's not allowed in Islam. And he remembers this image of Akbar. And of course, it's Akbar, it's a human being. And Akbar himself had things to say about how the artist, God makes an exception for the artist in a sense. And so I think, to me, it's not so much about religious belief as who's in power, And I think because the Mughals, like I said, had that confidence, they were able to commission all this art. So yeah, it's a small moment in the book, but you picked it up. So it seems to matter. Matter to you.
It does speak a lot, actually, that the particular image that Alif recalls. Now, Alif's family, as Anjum has already told us, represents that entire spectrum. We have Alif representing one end of it, but we have characters of all hues who bring to us that whole spectrum. And I would invite all of you to appreciate that for yourself by reading the novel. When I read the novel, it was not with Alif, the protagonist, that I associated the author. I constantly felt that there's this character named Miss Molloy, who's one of the colleagues of Alif in the school that he teaches. And Miss Molloy spoke to me almost in a way that you did. And she's a much traveled person. I was particularly fascinated by the conversation that she has with Alif about her journey to Kerala. So there is an entire section about life in Kerala, the culture of Kerala that Miss Molloy talks about. I'm sure our audience would love to hear about that from you. If you don't mind, maybe you could read a section, but maybe recall from memory what is your image of Kerala? Is it what you have conveyed through this book?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to read out the Kerala section in Kerala. That would be carrying coals to Newcastle. But yeah, one is reading all sorts of things. I mean, I read a lot of nonfiction and obviously a fair degree of fiction from all over the place. And because it's a novel about a historian and his colleague and friend, Miss Molloy, who's not a historian but is interested in history as much as Alif. And then there are other people like his teacher at university who he goes to meet at the beginning of the book, who's
the Maharishi.
The Maharishi, who's also obviously very, very steeped in history. So you need to give all of these characters a certain heft, and the only way to do it is through reading. But then I need to find a sort of, it's not enough that the facts exist, I think, in a novel, because the facts are already there. There needs to be a better reason for them to be there in a novel. And that always is instinct, right? You always have to go by your instinct about whether those facts would sit with that imagination or that character. Otherwise, your novel, and maybe I'm already taking that risk in this one, will become like just talking heads, right? Characters with different bunches of facts at their disposal. So, with Miss Malloy, I wanted her to be this contrast to Alif, because she is somebody who tests everything through experience. And in her case, the experience would be through travel, through constantly talking to people, not limiting herself to bookish knowledge. And Alif does. Alif has never left Delhi. Maybe he's been outside briefly, but he really is a Dilli wala, and he feels no need to go anywhere else or to be anyone else, really. He's very comfortable with his place. So one of the things Miss Palloy is always doing, and sometimes it becomes farcical almost, is she's bringing back these stories from her travels. And the Kerala bit is when she travels to Malabar, and she's fascinated by this really cosmopolitan history of people coming to Kerala over the centuries. The Muslims came so early in the game, the Arabs, the Syrian Christians, Egyptians before that, and so on. And what does that say about the culture of that place? But she's also talking to people in a very sort of, people you meet when you're staying in a hotel or you're eating a meal in a restaurant. She's also having those conversations. And what does that say about Kerala today? So I had actually written a much longer section where Miss Malloy is instructing Alif on how rich Kerala is, and he is bettering her because he knows more. And then she just throws up her hands. She's so fed up because she says, you know everything, but you don't taste anything for yourself. And to me, that's an interesting contrast, right? So Kerala as something that you've read about in books versus Kerala as something where you talk to the person whose hands are black, who's cleaning your hotel room, and you ask, why are this woman's hands black? And you discover it's because she works in a cashew nut processing factory, and the sap blackens your hands, and it's very manual labor, and people in Kerala have been working in that industry for a long time, and now they're losing out because it's being mechanized elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So things like that, which you will only find out if you travel. So to me, that's a very fascinating contrast, like I just said. So Kerala just fitted that very well because Alif really knows the history. He can tell you about like the Cherumal, is it Cherumal? Cheruman Perumal in Kozhikode, the Samudri dynasty and things like that. Just the many layers that went into making Kerala. And then Miss Malloy is being like, yeah.
And most of your journeys, I learned, to Kerala have been as part of the literary festival circuits, right? And here is a person who's also been a long-time editor of the literature section in the Caravan, the magazine, the print magazine Caravan. So how have these experiences, the literature festivals and particularly those, how have they shaped you, and what is your take on the ever-increasing number of literature festivals, and how do you respond to them as a writer?
Well, actually, most of my travel to Kerala has not been through literary festivals. This is only the second time I'm at a literary festival. The first one was in Calicut a few years ago. So I've just tended to travel through Kerala as a normal tourist, really, especially North Kerala, because my husband and I live part of the time in Coorg, and it's just a bus ride away from Talassery and Kannur, and so that part really fascinates me for the layers, the Muslims, the large Muslim population, and what that does to the culture. But I also am fascinated by Kochi. I've been to Trivandrum before. I've been to Kanyakumari, and that connected culture of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. So literature festivals is, what does one say about them sitting at a literature festival? It's sort of becoming hard to avoid, I think, unless you're very resolutely dead set against them. it seems to be that your editor and your publicist and everyone is like, it's almost fait accompli. You have a book out and you're going. But I think there are good ones and not so good ones, and I think one learns to tell when an audience is with you and really listening, and that's always wonderful if you're in a room full of people or an open venue like this and you have an audience that interested in listening to what you're saying. I don't know how good an idea it is to be talking about fiction, though. You know, I do it all the time, and I'm always wondering, because you want people to be curious about the novel. You obviously you want them to read it, but you don't want to over-determine their view of things. And there's only one reason to write novels, and that is to be open-ended, right? To not have made up your mind about something and want to explore it. If you have already made up your mind, why would you write a novel? I was just talking to a friend who's become a friend. She also published a novel recently. That's her debut. It's her debut novel. And we keep popping up in the same sort of spaces because somebody has decided that we've both written sort of a state of the nation novel. Hers is set in Maharashtra, and it's about young people debating the political situation today. So she said that somebody read both our novels and tweeted saying, why do Muslim protagonists in Indian English novels always have to be liberal characters? Why don't we have the other point of view? And to me, the answer to that would be because the novel itself is a liberal form. And like I said, it's an open-ended conversational form. So if you're writing a novel from the point of view of someone who has very stringent political or religious views, the novel will be over on page 1. There won't really be anything to say. And so you have to take recourse to these liberal characters because they are the only ones who live in doubt. I mean, I was just in conversation with Ram on his wonderful book, and part of it is about the liberal position, and he quotes Isaiah Berlin to say liberals are those sort of wedged between the hard faces on the right and the orthodox figures on the left. So to me, that just sums up the liberal position. I think Alif is totally that. It's not between right and left so much, but it is between certain kind of, let's say, Indians and certain kind of other Indians, and this sort of liberal inheritance that he feels very strongly about. And like you know, Discovery of India is a talisman for him. He's often rereading it through the course of the book.
Since you spoke about the audience, that being the one of the litmus test factors of a literature festival, let's find out how well the audience would respond to our session. And it's now time for me to open the session for queries and observations from the audience. Yeah, can the volunteers please ensure that a mic is moved around so that we can have questions from the audience?
My question is to understand your thought process when you write a book, a non-fiction. Even if it's a non-fiction, you want people to relate to it. You want them to think, right? So when you thought of Alif as a character who is a historian, to what extent did you think that when he teaches his kids, the children who are mostly between the age of 6 to 15, 9 to 15, so when he teaches, to what extent did you think of the conversations between the child and the teacher? And the other part of it is how hard it is to think of a liberal character in this atmosphere. To what extent will you push it so that, there is always a question of being woke, right? So where is that line? Is there a line? Is there a risk of, that line being blurred? When you have, the conservative forces also, they are also dominant, right? So that's my question. Thank you.
The first question about conversation, I don't really write that much non-fiction. I'm really a fiction writer. So for me, the thing about conversation is critical because a novel has to talk, right? I think one of the challenges often for fiction writers is how do you break out of your own voice, your own point of view, and let other people talk in the book. I don't want them all to sound like me. I don't want them to all sound like Alif, because they're often in conflict with him. So yeah, I mean, if you can pull that off and the reader thinks, yeah, this really sounds like people talking, I think you've done your job. But I don't know if it's effective till you read it and tell me it is. And your second question about woke and conservative, again, I'm not sure of these categories because I keep coming back to this category of the liberal. And I think the liberal is often not argumentative. It's not necessarily a position. A liberal I think liberal ends up being more like a sensibility than a strong position. And the question is, does it have any value anymore? When things are so polarized and positions are hardening, does that slightly in between undecided position have any value? Again, I think that's a question the novel is asking. I don't know the answer. But I'm trying through Alif to dramatize the question.
Anjum, how has your journey been from Neti Neti to History's Angels? What has been your learning from writing 3 novels?
I've actually written 4 novels. The first one was Lunatic in My Head, but yeah, the question still holds. I hope I've gotten better. I hope I've gotten better. I think that I'm also going further and further away from things that I've known either first-hand or second-hand. I'm trying to be more imaginative than I was in my earlier work, which was also, of course, about characters who were not exactly like me, but they were set in cities I've lived in. They were about people I might have known in half a sense. And now with Alif and Delhi and history teaching, the attempt is really to get away from myself, break out, and write about things that are more challenging. So I think the journey really is of trying to challenge yourself as much as you can. And I hope with the next one, I haven't written a word of it, but I'm hoping that it will go further in terms of subject matter and ideas than the previous 4.
We'll have more readers taking to the novel and then coming up with questions, hopefully at the next festival. But I would, before I wind up, like to read just one section from the novel, which I found very interesting and where I would place you as a novelist who was traveling. Yeah. So this is where, there's this line which says, less than 100 years ago, we were writers with pens of fire. We were brilliant socialists. Think of Hayes, think of Manto, dreaming of world revolution. Now all we can come up with is no concentration camps for us, hopefully, because they could never fit us all in. Now we write scared books about being mistaken for terrorists and about our children being mocked in school and about the list goes on. But in between those 2 extremes, we have a writer like Anjum Hasan. Yeah. So wish you all the very best in your journey ahead, and we hope to see the next book in print and in discussion at the next edition of MBIFL.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Kerala then.
Thank you.